Thank you. I hope you had a good lunch. My name is Rumman Chowdhury, and I am the global lead for Responsible AI at Accenture. And I'm here to talk a bit about what responsible AI means and what it means for the civic community. So the Responsible AI team at Accenture, just a little bit about us. Our goal is to understand and address social, regulatory, and economic impact of artificial intelligence from development to deployment and beyond. And it's led by myself. I'm a social scientist and a data scientist, and also Deborah Santiago. She's senior leadership in Accenture Legal. So we are, by definition, an interdisciplinary team. We have branches in London, Brussels, Singapore, San Francisco, and Atlanta. So when I first joined Accenture about 2.5 years ago, the responsible AI space was very early, very new. And I spent my first year on my job just talking about what it meant. And I used to start all my talks by saying there are 3 things I don't talk about: HAL, Terminator, and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs saving the world. And I did that because we really needed to focus on the very immediate concerns of algorithms. And since then, thankfully, people have become more aware and knowledgeable about what responsible AI means. And in 2018, my team launched the first fairness tool, which is an industry and enterprise level suite of products that can identify and mitigate harms, biases, et cetera, in your data set and your models. Now, moving forward to 2019, what I found was great. People wanted the technical tools, but then they realized, well, what do we do when we find bias? How do we even make a rubric for what it means for our algorithms to be fair? And what we've moved into is the place of agency and accountability. And you're seeing a lot of legislation being passed, but also even within corporations, they've realized that actually the first stop is about creating good governance. So just to define, what do we mean by responsible AI? And at Accenture, we define it as the practice of designing, building, and deploying artificial intelligence in a manner that empowers people and businesses and fairly impacts customers and society, allowing organizations to engender trust and use AI with confidence. Now, the key word here is trust. We need to make sure that people, citizens, end users, non-technical people, trust the technology. And right now, we're in a space of rapidly eroding trust because some of the common concerns about AI. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but these are the common conversations you'll have with people as we think about adopting artificial intelligence. Will it lead to mass joblessness? Will somebody create an AI that is sentient? What about the lack of transparency, and particularly for government services, because citizens have a right to things like due process? The lack of transparency of AI systems may actually introduce liabilities and problems. Inclusion and diversity of all forms, not just the lack of representation in tech rooms, but also the fact that fewer and fewer companies hold more and more of the power. Artificial stupidity, or as we call it, like the shortcomings of narrow AI. So artificial intelligence as we know it today is not a sentient singularity being, but it is a narrow use case based on narrow amounts of data that can do one task hopefully well. And finally, the notion of privacy. Will we erode our notions of data privacy and do things with data that we did not consent to? And when we think about responsible AI, we think about bias. It's a word that is used quite a bit. So when we think about bias, actually, so I'm a data scientist by background, but as I mentioned, I'm also a social scientist. And what I find is that when non-technical people, non-data scientists talk to data scientists and they use the word bias, they actually mean 2 different things. So a data scientist, when we say bias, we think about experimental bias introduced by design or by data. So this can be data bias, is your data set representative of the sample? Measurement bias, did you actually measure the thing appropriately, or was your measurement device broken? Response and reporting, and then design bias. The commonality between these things, they're all measurable. They're a quantifiable amount. So when I can say something like, I have a bias of X%. But when non-data scientists talk about bias, the conversation is about isms, sexism, racism, ageism. We're not talking about measurement bias or some sort of an esoteric numerical value. We're actually talking about harms in society. And it's really important because data is not an objective truth. It is reflective of pre-existing institutional, cultural, and social biases. And these are the harms that can result. And this is a list that's pulled together by the Future Privacy Forum. An immediate loss of opportunity, in other words, housing exclusion, job loss, economic loss, so being offered a different price from someone else because of some factor that should not have factored into the pricing algorithm. Social detriment, which I think there's a lot of conversation about that. Filter bubbles that reinforce stereotypes and confirmation biases. Social media being very negative and harmful to people. And finally, loss of liberty. So quite literally, the inability to be free in public, whether we worry about surveillance, human rights, or free speech. And the image we have here is about human rights and women being harassed disproportionately on Twitter, such that they feel unsafe in their own homes and in their own real world or analog world existences. But primary harms, in other words, the immediate loss of one of these things, is not the only kind of harm. And as we think about algorithms, there's actually the notion of secondary harms, and these are harder to think about. So algorithmic determinism and the notion of secondary harms are harms that are not an immediate person X did not get something because of some discriminatory outcome, denial of a job, etc. This is more about the fabric of society, the fabric of humanity and civilization, social capital, children's mindsets. So the image I have here is about how schools getting facial recognition tech for free. And actually a school in the city of New York is introducing facial recognition to presumably identify school shooters. Now, since schools have started to do active shooter drills, there have now studies have been released that show that it's actually detrimentally impacted, it's causing trauma to children to do an active shooter drill because they have to constantly think about and be paranoid about what if someone comes and tries to kill us. And now we're going to introduce facial recognition in schools, presumably that can identify, quote, problematic children. Now, there's a lot of issues with that. And here's where I talk about the notion of algorithmic determinism. So algorithmic determinism really is a measurement bias plus a feedback loop. In other words, when a facial recognition software is identifying a face as being possibly aggressive, that is an imperfect technology, and it is a technology that is based on the notion that there is one way to look normal. And if we respect the diversity of people, when we think of people with disabilities, we think of people of different races, different backgrounds, and even culturally, how we express ourselves non-verbally, we can quickly see how there could be a bias here that leans towards a particular way of being. Now, what happens with algorithmic determinism, it's not just bad that particular people may be disproportionately targeted, but what happens is, as those people are targeted, there is some system by which they're processed or they're pulled aside or something happens to them, and that data gets put back into the system, thus creating a feedback loop. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, what we're seeing is, as I mentioned, an erosion of trust. Now, we're quickly seeing that the imperfect use of these algorithms in a way that harms individuals are making people take a step back and think about the use of these technologies. And here's why. To the average citizen, AI is immediate, impactful, and invisible. It seems like magic. It's something that, once deployed, impacts hundreds of millions of people all around the world. It's impactful in that it can deny you a job, it can deny you housing. And most importantly, it's invisible. You don't know if there's an algorithm being used to determine whether or not you should get a job. And often we don't have the right or the ability to ask about it or to do anything if something goes wrong. So when we think about responsible AI, there are some very specific things that we think about. And one of the terms that's used quite a bit is unintended consequences. In other words, most designers of artificial intelligence systems are well-meaning. They are well-intentioned. They are not malicious actors. They are not trying to hurt or harm people. But of course, intention does not equal impact. So unintended consequences can occur. And in the ethics and AI community, the acronym we sit on is FATE: fairness, accountability, transparency, and explainability. Fairness meaning, do we have an expectation of similar outcomes for different subgroups? In other words, are the things that are influencing the outcome the things that should be influencing the outcome? Next is the notion of accountability. So within an organization, who's responsible? What do you do if there's a potentially biased outcome? The notion of transparency. Do we understand how the model works? And finally, explainability. Can we identify why an output was arrived at? In other words, again, going back to the notion of due process and the right to information, in particular government use cases, explainability and transparency are very, very critical. But when we think about responsibility, I'm going to devil's advocate myself right now. The notion of explainability is necessary but insufficient, because explainability is a top-down method of providing reasoning for actions. So it's me as let's say a lawyer writing an end-user license agreement that is then distributed to people who will use a product. So every time you've updated your software on your phone, there's this long document that you never read that's written in legalese that you don't understand, that completely, by the way, explains to you what your rights to privacy are. But that's not useful to you, is it? You don't read the document, you don't have an understanding of it, and you certainly don't action on it. Instead, we have to strive for understanding. So understanding thinks about how to explain the technology from the perspective of the end user. So we have to provide relevant and, more importantly, actionable outcomes. And then moving on to the second then, transparency, similarly, necessary but insufficient. Transparency simply provides insights into the system. It says, this is what we are doing. What it doesn't address is systems of power and the ability to take action. And that's why we need agency. Agency provides individuals the ability to change or alter how they interact with the system. And at Accenture, while we do build technical solutions and technical tools, our take is that technology alone cannot deliver on the full promise of AI. And I'm here today to talk a bit about the notion of governance of AI systems. So what do we mean by governance? And I brought up agency and accountability. So agency, as I mentioned, moves beyond transparency. It allows individuals to raise a flag and say, hey, there's something going on here that's wrong. Agency also has to have a clear chain of command for direction and principles from the top, and then clarity and explanation from further down. This is a notion that I call police patrols versus fire alarms. Often when we think about governance, we think about a top-heavy system of monitoring people in a police patrol fashion. When we think about using artificial intelligence and the scale and scope at which it will be used, it's going to be impossible to do police patrols. Instead, people have to be aware on how to pull a fire alarm. So if you think about it, if there were a fire in this room, we all know what to do. Someone's going to pull the alarm, and then we're all going to go out that door and go outside and wait. Nobody actually put out the fire because we trust that there is a system in place by which the experts will come and take care of the fire. But we were all able to identify what we should do and safely take action. And importantly, we raised the flag. And we need to create that for algorithmic systems. And secondly, accountability. Can we think about potential harms and why they're happening? So is there a disparate impact? Is there a business necessity for the practice, or are there reasonable alternatives rather than the questionable practice at hand? This is drawn from Supreme Court ruling Griggs versus Duke Power Company, which has often been the thinking behind some of the tools and products that have been built, drawing from the legal space. And then finally, can we address and redress harms? So if something will inevitably go wrong, there's no such thing as a perfect system. We need to build in a way of fixing things if they go wrong. And for that, we need a governance ecosystem. So we need government, companies, and consumers working together to create good governance. And everybody has their role to play. I want to talk a bit about everybody has their role to play. So for government, it's to provide a forum for discussion, cultivate a culture of responsibility, a culture of ethics, have transparency and clarity around decision making, and create internal governance processes in alignment with regulation and industry best practices. In other words, what are other parts of the world doing? How are other people tackling these problems? And how can your local government utilize that knowledge to make things available to citizens? And for consumers, of course, the responsibility is to educate and be engaged. Take advantage of the information that's put out there, educate yourself, and then also take advantage of the systems that will be put in place for you to raise your voice and raise your hands. For companies, the goal is to provide transparency into practices and processes, and also, importantly, to implement internal governance mandates. So this same ecosystem needs to exist internally at every single company. And at Accenture, that's actually what we're doing. So we've created a group called Responsible Business. And what Responsible Business does is a multi-stakeholder group that gets together and discusses our perspectives on different artificial intelligence technology. So what is our viewpoint on recommendation systems being used on children or facial recognition technologies? So what this group does is gets together and debates and discusses what Accenture's principles should be. This then gets handed over to another group, which will be able to evangelize this through the organization. So we have internally at our company, and we suggest every company that's using artificial intelligence systems create the same sort of internal governance mandate. So what does that mean? What does this ecosystem exactly consist of? So in a few weeks, Accenture is going to be launching a publicly available governance guidebook. And what this governance guidebook does is it helps walk you through what you need to do to govern AI systems, and importantly, why. So it has multiple parts. So first, by the way, we recognize that most, if not all, organizations have some sort of a compliance program, right? So when we actually initially did a study of tech leaders and asked, well, do you have a system in place for governing AI? Most of them said yes, because they were thinking about their existing technological systems, their tech compliance systems. But those are actually insufficient, as we're finding out. So while these standards can serve as a basic foundation, we need to expand on that infrastructure. So the first thing to do, as I mentioned, is create a set of guiding principles. So there's high-level guidance to ensure there's consistency. As I mentioned, when we first launched the fairness tool, people were really keen to adopt it, but quickly realized that in order to have internal consistency over the many, many projects that they were going to build, they actually needed to have some guidance from leadership. And that group should be should consist of, as I mentioned, an interdisciplinary group of individuals. Second is the notion of tone from the top. So to create an ethical culture, leadership needs to understand and actively promote these guiding principles. So it's one thing to make a nice document in a PDF and stick it up on your website, but how do you then evangelize and implement them at the project level? And that's pretty hard. If you say something like, children should not be manipulated by recommendation systems, and that is our guidance. Anytime there's a team creating some sort of recommendation system, they're going to have to think about how do we measure and track who is a child and if that child is somehow being manipulated. That is not an easy thing to do. So often there's a lot of focus on guiding principles, but not a lot of focus on the actual delivery and deployment of these guiding principles. And that's what people like myself do at these companies. So tone from the top means not just creating these principles, but evangelizing them and helping create the reporting structure and making sure that leadership adheres to these guiding principles. The next step is training and communication. So you have to educate key internal stakeholders. So at Accenture, not everybody is a technical person. We have plenty of data scientists, about 10,000 data scientists at Accenture, but also we have consultants, strategy folks who are not technical people. They're technically savvy, but they're not data scientists. How can those people understand how to implement these guiding principles? So we have to educate key stakeholders and then evangelize that throughout from a tactical and impactful perspective. So this would be risk assessments, testing mechanisms, etc. Phase 3 is something called red teams and fire alarms. So the fire alarms analogy I mentioned earlier, we have to have a system by which people can raise red flags. They can say there's something wrong here. Red teams is the notion of a group of specialists to identify potential fires, basically try to break the system. So the purpose of this group is to take an AI system and try to induce some sort of bias or induce a negative outcome before you deploy it. So it's a stress test. Phase 4, which I personally am a big fan of, is metrics for positive impact. Now, one of the hardest things to do as responsible AI is to actually make a value proposition for responsible AI. Everybody believes in the social imperative. That's not the problem. But when selling the product, you can say there's an efficiency gain, there's a monetary gain in some way. What do I have to offer in responsible AI? Pretty much what I say is, if you listen to me, things don't blow up. So if I do my job, nothing happens. Kind of hard to show a value proposition. Our suggestion is to create metrics for positive impact. Can we show more people were educated, more people were engaged positively? Can we create metrics around good use of an AI system that has positive impact on individuals and not just rely on things like efficiency gains and money saved? And the 5th phase, and this is very much tied to the notion of fire alarms, and red teams is fostering a culture of constructive dissent. So avoiding monoculture, promoting dissent channels, and incorporating dissent through inclusive design. So what does that mean? That means bringing the impacted communities to the table, even if they're non-technical folks, from the design end. And after deployment, in your organization and outside your organization, do you allow for a culture of whistleblowing or for people to say there's something wrong here? And this would mean protection for whistleblowers. This would mean encouragement for people to speak up. And this would mean strong enforcement of non-retaliation policies. So in conclusion, responsible AI is more than just tech tools. We need to address the consequences on impacted communities. And the civic sector is the glue that will play a key role in empowering these communities. Voices of individual citizens need to be heard in government and beyond government as we think about scaling and deploying all these technologies. We cannot, as business leaders and government leaders, think of all the ways in which there could be an unintended consequence. Engaging the community, engaging businesses, and engaging government via a healthy government ecosystem is the best way to do that. Thank you.